This episode of the Beauty Industry podcast was brought to you by One Spa World. Do what you love, travel the world, and rapidly advance your career at the same time. Hello and welcome to the Beauty Industry podcast, your online support community for the professional beauty industry. I am your host, founding director of Beauty Industry, Tamara Shaw. Here we are closing the competitive gap and speaking your language. This is a platform created and dedicated to the professional beauty industry, valuing community over competition. We serve to help connect you with inspiration from industry experts, expand your knowledge through educational pieces, and bring you the latest in product and technology innovation. This is Beauty Industry. Today's guest is no stranger to the Beauty Industry podcast. As she returns today talking all things inflammation with us, it's Dr. Donna Marcal. For those who haven't yet listened to Donna's episode, you can tune in and hear more of her story on episode 26. Otherwise, if you would just prefer to listen to this episode, I'll give you a brief introduction now. Donna is a biochemist with a doctorate in inflammation and has since created two of her own product ranges, Dermatonics Skincare and Reliever Med, A natural skincare brand, and B, a massage balm for inflammatory joints and muscles, which can be used during massage of body treatments. Today, Donna and I discuss the wound healing process, inflammatory cells you must know about, and how you can help your clients reduce their inflammation via stress and slow the aging process. Please forgive me in advance for my microphone today. It had a mind of its own and it sounds like I am speaking underwater for most of the conversation, but it was just too good to throw this entire chat out and start again. So I promise to organize it a little bit better for future episodes. Here's Donna and I on the topic of inflammation. Welcome back to the podcast, Donna.
Hi, it's good to be here again.
So good to have you. Donna, you're an expert in inflammation, and when I was thinking of who I could have on the podcast to cover this topic, it was always going to be you. And though you're an expert, I would love to start with the basics of what is inflammation.
Yeah. So inflammation essentially is a normal response in the body to things like a foreign invader, when we injure ourselves, stress. So, I mean, anything along the lines of from, you get a cold to, you have a major accident and there's massive trauma to your body. So your body needs to respond to that invasion to your body. So it's a very normal response, typically. The body is basically trying to protect itself and heal itself, and that's why it's there to protect it. Now, obviously, inflammation can go quite wrong or get chronic, but that's in other cases. But what inflammation generally is trying to protect yourself. So bacteria gets into your system. Typically a lot of what you feel when you get sick or things like that is a lot of the symptoms of your body trying to protect yourself and not necessarily the invader. There are some symptoms that come with, viruses and bacteria, but a lot of it is what your body's trying to do to deal with this.
Fantastic. I think we forget that sometimes.
Yeah,
we do. We just think about the skin being inflamed, but not everything else.
Yeah. So in terms of the skin as well, the skin is a bit easier to see the inflammation because you see it. You see that redness, you see that injury, whereas internally, you start feeling, I don't feel very well. I'm starting to get a fever. And these are all the signs of inflammation. So the signs of inflammation, and there's 5 of them, and they actually have, way back when they put Latin names to them. And the first one is pain or dolor. So you feel something hurts, but it's all sort of interrelated. The second one is heat, so you cut yourself even on a cut. If you have quite a bad cut, as it's healing, you'll actually feel that it's a bit warm. And redness, I mentioned that. So heat and redness, quite often inflammation is red. So on the surface, you'll see that. Inside, you won't necessarily, for example, tonsillitis. You look down your child's throat when they have tonsillitis and it's all red and inflamed. And swelling. Swelling is another one. An area becomes swollen. And then eventually also the fifth one is loss of function. So those are all various signs of that you have inflammation going on in a particular area. And the way those are all interrelated, like what inflammation actually does is it helps to increase blood flow to the area. So that's for delivering proteins and white blood cells, to help defend that particular area. So you'll see the redness, you'll feel a bit more warmth when you have a fever. It triggers your white blood cells to migrate to the area, and they multiply and they secrete all kinds of cytokines and recruit other cells. So there's a whole lot going on as soon as some kind of injury happens.
It's funny that you say, there are 5 kind of main principles of inflammation, because I guess we subconsciously or unconsciously rather know that, but when you kind of point out what those 5 are, it's like, yeah, wow, okay, it takes 5 things for us to actually recognize inflammation, which is, it's quite funny. And you started talking there about the white blood cells migrating to the source of the inflammation.
Yes.
And we generally know this as the wound healing process.
Yes.
Can you talk more about that and just explore, maybe how long it takes as well?
Yeah. So the first thing that happens when a wound is generated, so there's 4 phases, and a lot of people tend to forget about the first phase. So the first phase is called the hemostasis phase. And this is essentially, typically when you get a cut or an injury, the body needs to try and stop that bleeding. So that's the key thing. It's the emergency response in your system. And what happens, and this happens within seconds. So the first phase is a phase that's sort of within seconds to minutes. It's very quick. So what happens are platelets are recruited. So those are little cells that help start the clogging of where you get a cut or an injury. So the platelets are recruited, and they come into contact with that collagen that's open, and that collagen activates your platelets and begins an aggregation cascade. So your platelets are recruited, they aggregate and clump, and they basically form a dam at the injury site to help stop the bleeding. After that initial step, proteins such as thrombin come in, and they start help forming that fibrin clot, that plug, to help set coagulation in motion. So like I said, this first step is triggered within seconds and lasts sort of about 6 minutes. It takes roughly about 6 minutes for a fibrin plug to completely form. So that's the first step. The second step is what we know as the defense or the inflammatory stage. And this is when our white blood cells start being recruited. The first type of white blood cell that comes in are neutrophils. So they're very quick acting cells. They circulate around in your blood, and they're ready there. They basically circulate around your blood, monitoring for things like bacteria and viruses and things that shouldn't be there, and they mop them up. So this is your primary responder, the white blood cell. They're very short-lived. The neutrophils only last a few days, but they're very powerful cells, very antibacterial, and very quick to respond. They actually have little granules in them. So they contain granules inside the cell. And these are the cells that generate your oxidative burst. So they'll generate reactive oxygen species. So now quite often we think of reactive oxygen species sometimes as being bad. You hear about in the environment, pollution and things generate reactive oxygen species. However, reactive oxygen species are very powerful at killing bacteria. So they are important locally and in a controlled manner. So that's what the neutrophils do first, is they respond quickly within a few minutes. Spurt out all these cytokines and reactive oxygen species to mop up any bacteria or things like that are in that open wound. They want to make sure it's clean.
That makes sense.
Exactly. So they go in there to try and mop things up. So this response peaks at about 24 to 48 hours after injury. And the neutrophils are gone within 3 days. Like I said, they're quite short-lived. But what happens is, as the neutrophils are there and they've been triggered to respond, what they do is they then recruit macrophages. Now, macrophages are like my favorite cell in the whole world. So I spent several years studying macrophages in all of my research. They're just an absolutely amazing cell. So now macrophages actually come from a cell, excuse me, come from a cell called monocytes. So monocytes are what are actually circulating in your blood. So neutrophils recruit monocytes, and then what they do is they get differentiated or mature into macrophages. And macrophages are a highly phagocytic type of cell. And what that means is they basically gobble up everything. They gobble up all the garbage, the bacteria, and they actually gobble up dead cells as well. So the neutrophils...
They're like the Pac-Man, aren't they?
Exactly. That's a fantastic word. They're like a Pac-Man. It's true. And so they'll even mop up the dead bits of cells that are at the injury site. So even neutrophils, you know, they have to go, once they're finished, they have to go somewhere, right? So the body mops them up. So the macrophage will help also deliver other important cytokines and mop up, do the master phagocyte job that it needs to do. So that response lasts about 3 to 6 days. And this is also when you really start to see some of that redness and swelling, because of everything that's going on in you know, underneath, under the scenes with the macrophages and the neutrophils. So those cells have done their job to clean up that site. So they're doing that job so you don't get an infection. So that happens so that everything is all nice and clean. Then the next stage is your proliferation stage. So under normal conditions, your wound is cleaned out, the bacteria have been kept at bay. And you know, your platelets have started to coagulate and start closing the wound. But what needs to happen next is you need to fill the wound. So quite often, so sometimes you'll feel like, say you have surgery and you feel your scar, and along that scar line, you can kind of feel it's a bit empty underneath, like where the two pieces of tissue have been stuck together. So it's stuck together, whether that's with tape or stitching, and the body has started to clump, you know, clot and seal it together, but it still needs to fill that wound and sort of restructure that wound. So what happens in the proliferation stage is you start to get that filling of the wound, you get that contraction of the wound, and that's where, you know, if you get a cut and you can see that your skin is pulling, like you have the scab in the middle and it starts to pull and it's kind of itchy. So that's what's happening there is the skin is actually starting to contract so you can fill that wound. And that's also why, you know, when you have major surgery that obviously you have it stitched to help your body keep that together, or even, you know, your child falls, bumps his head, you know, it's not too bad, but they need that little tape that pulls it together a little bit. It's giving your body a little bit of help with that stage. Now, this stage is actually it can be quite a long stage. It can last anywhere from 4 days up to almost a month, depending on how big your injury is. So say you have a paper cut, you know, that's something that's very simple. That's only going to take a few days to fully resolve. Whereas if you have massive trauma or surgery, that's going to last almost a month, that stage, because there's a lot of, like, it's been a major trauma and it's a lot of remodeling there.
Yeah.
And then the last stage is the maturation phase. So you've filled the wound, everything's going nice. Haven't gotten an infection, but now what the tissue needs to gain its strength back. So although the tissue has been filled, you actually have to regain the strength and integrity of that initial site. So it's doing its best to return back to normal. So what happens here is the collagen fibers actually start reorganizing. The tissue starts remodeling, and the cells in there actually start to mature into the cells that they're supposed to be. You know, whether it was, you know, you have bone cells that need to repair, you have the different layers of the skin that need to repair. You get stem cells that are recruited, and then they have to mature and differentiate into the cells that it's meant to be there. And that's all assisted by cytokines that are in the area and other secreted factors. So the other tissue that's normal around it will start helping to tell the cells you need to differentiate into a bone cell. Now, this obviously can go wrong as well, where you have, you know, keloid scarring, where it doesn't heal as nice as it should. So sometimes it can go wrong, but in most cases, in a healthy person, it can heal quite well, and the body does what it's supposed to do. So that's essentially the wound healing cascade in a nutshell. But what you can see is that there are stages that are very quick and fast, but the whole entire process actually takes a lot longer than probably what we think. there's a lot
Yeah.
going on underneath and in the background that you may not necessarily see that continues for a while after you induce an injury.
Yeah, it's so funny because every time, sometimes people say, oh, if you had a superpower, what would it be? And my little nerdy brain always goes to the wound healing process and
Mm.
thinks, well, we already kind of have this superpower because if we inflame or if we cut, we are self-healing.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of see it on cartoons and things like that, where, you've got this big cut and all of a sudden they look at the wound and it just heals itself. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not that fast, but
Yeah.
we really are superhumans. It's
It
pretty
is.
cool, isn't it?
It's amazing. And what's really interesting is children up to the age of about 11, their regeneration capacity is unbelievable. So it's, there's even been cases, and sorry if somebody gets squeamish over this, but if children, lose, part of their finger, like say they're in an accident or they cut their finger, they'll actually be able to almost fully regrow that, because just they're still almost in that sort of it's not newborn, but they're in that stage where their body is learning how to build all their tissues. So they'll be able to regenerate a lot of things more than an adult would. So their regeneration capacity is unbelievable.
Isn't that incredible? So just to recap, we have 4 phases. So we've got hemostasis, which responds within seconds, and that's where we have the neutrophils, which are kind of like the monitoring cells in our white blood cell, and they are antibacterial. So
Yeah.
they are going to basically go to the site, kill all of the bacteria, clean the wound, and then we have the inflammatory process. And that kind of stage is where we, from the monocytes, we are recruiting the macrophages, which are like our little dead Pac-Man, who are gobbling up little dead skin cells and everything else that's in there to once again, I guess, clean the site,
Yeah.
and deliver cytokines at the same time.
Yeah.
From here, and depending on how inflamed the site is dependent on how long it's going to take, but approximately 1 to 4 days, then we go into that proliferation. And so in the proliferation, we get the contraction of the wound. We're trying to gather all of our fibrin and our tissue together to pull the wound and to knit it. And sometimes at the site that can feel kind of maybe flaky or itchy, maybe dry as well. And then once again, depending on the size of the wound, that can take quite some time before we go into the maturation stage, which is, as the name suggests, where the site starts to mature. We now have a better quality of collagen forming. We have that scar now starting to regain and smooth in texture, and everything's just kind of more maturing before we go on to have a quote unquote normal area or site.
Yeah. Yep.
Perfect. And I guess as well, we have to remember as skin therapists that for this very reason is why we tell our clients, or why we have protocols in the treatment room, for IPL or for skin needling, for example. If you don't let the skin completely mature, then you're just coming back in at a certain stage and re-inflaming what has already been inflamed.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's one thing to keep in mind with the different procedures, is that for something, as you get more invasive in the treatments, you need to leave more downtime in between the treatments. Otherwise, then you're just inducing chronic inflammation. Something, less invasive, when you're down at the bottom of the scale, like microdermabrasion, you're being pretty gentle with the skin. But then, once you get, I haven't had microneedling done myself, but, once you get to microneedling and you're actually inducing a minor wound, that's a minor wound, but still you have to be very mindful of that. And the fact that the cascade that happens afterwards actually takes quite some time, and that you have to allow the body to actually do its own thing, which is why I think it's good that recommendations, from what I've heard and what I've, interacted with, that post microneedling, you typically basically want to leave the skin alone for a good 48 hours before, which is good, because you want to make sure you're keeping inflammation in check. However, you want to make sure the body is doing its normal cascade of wound healing, especially in that first critical, 48 hours.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. And I love how you're saying there, you can't just do a treatment and feel like you understand the protocol of a treatment without actually understanding the inflammation pathway. Because if you are doing something like microneedling, you're getting that hemostasis, you're getting the blood clot on the surface of the skin. But for some reason, the neutrophils might not be actually working so well, or there's something internally wrong. We don't have enough vitamin K or whatever it may be. And we can't have that coagulation of the blood going from a liquid into a gel form, then you as the therapist need to be really mindful of how that skin's then going to progress through that inflammatory cascade.
Yeah. And that's where, and I mean, you talk a lot about consultation, and I mean, that's where, again, the consultation is so important, because the person that's getting the treatment may not think about certain things, but if you ask the questions, like, they may not put two and two together and say, oh, well, I take aspirin every day for something. That might affect things a little bit. Are they on blood thinners? Are they a slightly older patient that has had heart conditions and they're on blood thinners, or even platelet aggregation inhibitors? Those are going to affect things. So whether or not, that's where some deeper consultation comes about, where should you be doing microneedling on that client? And whether or not that you go and say, go talk to your GP or whoever and say, look, this is what you'd like to get done. How am I going to go? Or is it something where they can, not take their medication just for a short time before their treatment and then restart again after? That all takes consultation with their GP. Their GP might say, yeah, you'd be okay. Miss that one medication and then take it. But then again, that's a pretty big deal. It depends on what kind of medication they're on, or even autoimmune diseases. Some people, again, may not think about the fact that they have a disease where they have impaired immune function, and maybe, all these things. So that's, again, where the consultation is just really important for these amazing new treatments that are coming out, where you're getting amazing responses on the skin. However, you are generating a wound, and you really have to be careful with what you're doing with particular people, and just probing those questions with people, because again, they might not think that something's important.
Might not think it's relevant in a skin treatment.
Exactly. They think, oh, I'm going to get a facial, but then the therapist says, oh, well, I really think microneedling would help, with this. But then you have to fully explain what microneedling is all about, and other treatments where you can break the skin, and just have that really good consultation.
Yes, amazing. You spoke there about the neutrophils, monocytes, and macrophages. I'm wondering if there are any other kind of main inflammatory cells that perhaps therapists should have a basic knowledge of.
Well, those really are the key ones. Like the three that I have here are, the first one is the platelets. They're the first responders. Don't mess with them. So when your mom was saying, don't pick your scab or don't wipe, it's important, as when something starts bleeding, don't keep wiping off that blood. That's why they say hold an injury site, or, because it helps it to stop bleeding and to clot. If you keep wiping that surface, then you keep starting it off from square one. You need to allow it to coagulate. So that's why, even if you make a tiny little teeny tiny pinpoint size, but it bleeds a tiny little bit, and where you leave it and it scabs. So you don't want to mess with the platelets. Again, platelets and the platelets in the coagulation system is very important in the very first steps. So you want to make sure that is allowed to proceed. The neutrophils, like I said, the neutrophils are really amazing. They respond within the first minutes to hours, and it's why we need inflammation. So there's a place for taking anti-inflammatory agents. We need them, but there's also a place for our body to be able to normally respond.
We'll be back with more from Donna after this short message from our sponsors. Community, I've spoken many times about my incredible experience working overseas in my career, and now you can too. Imagine working for the leading spa operator on board luxury cruise ships. Well, One Spa World operates day spas on over 160 luxury cruise ships which sail the 7 seas. So if you're a passionate beauty therapist who is looking for more excitement in your everyday life, then you are in luck, because One Spa World are now recruiting. Do what you love, travel the world, and rapidly advance your career all at the same time. To see if you've got what it takes to work on board, download your free Career at Sea information pack from realseachange.com. That's real, SEA, change.com. Thank you so much to One Spa World for making this episode possible. And now, back to Donna.
Some other important cells that play a part in the immune system, but not so much in this initial inflammatory cascade that you'll hear a lot about as well, are lymphocytes. So lymphocytes are another white blood cell that play more of a long-term part in your response and in your healing process and in defending yourself from pathogens. And they produce antibodies and all these kinds of things as well.
And it's interesting that we talk there about blood and platelets and having a good quality platelet to actually allow that coagulation of the site to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this all really comes from internally what we're putting in our mouth.
Exactly.
Because all of our blood is really like a cocktail, a concoction of what we eat. So I'm wondering if you can share with us maybe some foods that are are inflammatory.
Because inflammation comes from our food, our environment, all that kind of stuff. So we're being bombarded these days. But I'm trying to think if it was Rebecca Miller recently that you spoke with that was talking about certain foods like this. And basically, it's all the bad stuff. It's all the stuff that tastes good. So things like your refined carbs. So think white breads, croissants. They're very processed and they don't have much grain to them. Things like artificial trans fats, they lower your good cholesterol, they impair your endothelial cell function. So these are the endothelial cells, are the cells that line your blood vessels as well. And they induce all kinds of inflammatory mediators. Also fried foods, because they're typically, you go to Macca's or something and they're all fried in vegetable oils. They taste really good, but they're high in omega-6 fatty acids, which are not good for you. All these things can trigger different parts of inflammatory cascades, or they can modify molecules like you hear of your bad cholesterol, which is LDL, low density lipoprotein. Once that molecule gets modified by something like oxidation, it becomes basically way worse. It becomes much more pro-inflammatory, able to form atherosclerosis, all those kind of things. So these foods will do that to some of these molecules. Sugary drinks, all your sodas and high sugar drinks, because what it does is it generates high levels of fructose, and the fructose will increase several anti-inflammatory markers. Red meat. So red meat and processed meat. I mean, red meat is important in your diet, but of course in moderation. But processed meats, what they all contain, especially as they're processed or as they're cooked, they contain advanced glycation end products. And they just do, like, you hear of them being called age or ages. So they just do all kinds of bad things to the body. Like it's just, you don't want to be producing lots of advanced glycation end products. They're just horrible. Margarine, lard, or shortening. I mean, they're just like lard. I mean, that's just, like, I mean, our parents probably used to cook with lard all the time or bake, but it made for a really yummy, pastry. And of course, excessive alcohol, it affects your healthy gut bacteria. And a lot of this also links back to that healthy gut bacteria as well. All these foods, having a healthy gut. So of course, all of these foods, of course, we've heard this before. It doesn't mean completely cut them out of your diet. These are, as they say, as they would say in daycare with my kids, these are sometimes foods, So, we have to really monitor how much we add these into your diet. The typical, we hear it over and over again. Stick to your leafy greens, your fresh vegetables. Fish is amazing. All those kinds of things that are, higher in the better fats and oils that are free from all these modified, these advanced glycation end products and things that are going to trigger inflammation. So again, it's in moderation. But those are, but basically it's any of those, typical processed sugary type foods that are not going to be helpful to your system and contribute to inflammation.
Yeah, and just honoring food as Mother Nature intended, having
Exactly.
polyphenols and having your nutraceuticals, things that literally a piece of food from a plant or, from an animal is how food was always eaten. And then I guess we as humans have just come along and thought, oh, we can actually make that taste a little bit more like an apple or more
Exactly.
like, something. So I guess just going back to what food really is. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, food is a way that I actually cope with stress. And I know that stress is huge in inflammation. I'm wondering if we can explore that.
Yep, of course. So stress, of course, plays a big part in inflammation. And we know that one of the main molecules that's involved in stress is cortisol. Now, cortisol is typically anti-inflammatory in a normal state. So it's part of your, fight and flight response, defending your body. However, when the stress is uncontrolled or you have excessive stress, you're actually impairing the body's ability to allow cortisol to regulate inflammation. So, and again, stress hampers your immune system. Especially when it's chronic stress, your body your immune system just doesn't function properly. And people feel that, when people are constantly stressed, they're always tired. They feel run down. They get sick more often, all these things, because the inflammatory and your own body's defense system just can't function properly. So when you get stressed and you get, you see that person getting sick more often, it doesn't necessarily mean they're getting infected more often because they're obviously in the same environments. It's just their ability to deal with that bacteria or virus is impaired. Same with, you think of eczema. People that are, you can tell when people are more stressed, someone who typically has eczema off and on in their life, you can almost tell when they're stressed because their eczema has flared up. So it's triggering that response. So yes, stress definitely plays a very big part in inflammation. It definitely can trigger it off, make it worse. And it's all interrelated, because then if you have more inflammation and you have all these diseases progressing, then you get more stressed, because your eczema has flared up. So you're stressed because you don't look great and all this kind of stuff. So it kind of turns into a bit of a vicious cycle.
Yeah, you're completely right there, because I guess when we are stressed, then we don't have the healthiest eating habits. When we don't have the healthiest eating habits, we're influencing the gut, which we know plays a huge part on inflammation. And then when we have inflammation, we're having that link back to cortisol, which makes us stress. And it is just this really vicious cycle.
So then it kind of comes back to your mindset then. So then in order to break that cycle, it's a matter of, because a lot of people say that, oh, I know I should go to the gym. I know it's going to make me feel better. It's just getting out of that mindset and getting yourself into that positive frame to get yourself out of it and be eating better. And it's baby steps. And then this comes again, just the mindset, baby steps. You're not going to tackle everything overnight. You're not going to suddenly, if someone has has bad habits in eating, doesn't exercise, doesn't take care of themselves, maybe even smokes, you can't change those things all at once, because it's not going to happen. You have to try and take baby steps in one thing at a time and then you'll start slowly seeing the improvements and everything, because you're dealing with one little bit at a time.
Yeah, I like that. It's almost the process of elimination as well.
That too. Which one's the worst? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and sometimes when people get inflammation of some sort, they don't know where it comes from. That would be, I guess, is that the first place where you kind of point people towards, is say, well, let's take a look at, is it the mind? Is it the skin? Is it the body? Is it the gut? Is it what you're putting in your mouth? Like, let's actually have that process of elimination and find out what that trigger is.
Yeah. But there's also a time where it's very important to start involving health practitioners. So
100%.
If you're starting to feel chronically stressed or something is always hurting or, things, then that's a big flag to go start seeing a GP. It might be nothing. It might just be, but it's a good time. Like if you don't get to go to see the GP very often and you're starting to feel rubbish and and your diet's not great, and things just don't feel right inside, and you've got to get yourself on a better track. I think a good start is if you don't see your GP regularly, is to ensure that everything is okay on the inside, and that's where you can do all your blood tests to check all kinds of markers, and just see what you need to change in order to get things back in line. Now, our bodies are pretty amazing, and they'll try and regulate stuff. So, we have to be in some pretty bad shape for a lot of things to get completely out of whack. But, if you're having a lot of pain, you need to check if there's something more going on, like arthritis, or, you always have a sore back, or you always have a sore knee. The longer that, you leave those kinds of chronic inflammation unchecked, they can start they can start actually damaging your tissues. So it's one thing to have, inflammation that goes on, which is normal, but to have it chronically continue, it needs to be addressed. And that doesn't necessarily mean to have to take some kind of pharmaceutical. It just means to find out what's going on, and then you can go from there.
Yes. And something that I think maybe people don't quite realize in terms of information at the moment is the amount of pollution that we are consuming. And I think we'll probably find out more about this within like 5 or 10 years, as it gets worse and as the climate starts to develop and change.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can then explain for us that relation of pollution and inflammation.
Yeah. So pollution can definitely trigger inflammation. So pollution, although we don't see a lot of it, we can smell it. Pollution is very small foreign particles that are either getting in contact with your skin or in your lungs, or they contaminate our water or food. And they certainly can trigger an inflammatory response, or what they can do is they can exacerbate a response that someone would normally have. The typical example being asthma.
Yes.
So the particulate matter that's in the air, they sort of categorize it into different sizes. So anything that is less than 2.5 microns, which is quite small, but that can get into the lungs. Anything that goes down to 10 microns, that gets stuck in the nasal passageways. So our nasal passageways are actually quite good at filtering out some stuff, so they'll stop certain things getting all the way into our lungs. However, things that are on the much smaller level, like more microscopic level, like 2.5 microns, those get into our lungs. So that's not good. Now, someone who has, there's not too much pollution around, they're a relatively healthy person, their immune system is in check, they'll be able to deal with those particles and those invaders. So the particles that are that size, down to the 2.5 microns, are things like exhaust from our cars, fuel burning, forest fires. So, you have hazard reduction, and they give you a warning, and there's all this smoke around. So that actually doesn't just get into your nose, that actually gets into your lungs. Things like when a volcano erupts, and there's all kinds of smoke and particles into the air, and these particles, they can actually travel really, really far. So that's also why, I live up here in the Blue Mountains, and, we're a big bushfire zone. And so they actually do quite a lot of hazard reduction. But, it was about a month ago, they were doing hazard reduction up here in Hazelbrook, but in Katoomba, up here where we are, it was, clear skies and blue. But down in North Sydney, people weren't able to breathe, because that's how far it traveled and how far it affected people. So that's things like that can really, really affect people. So what can happen when those particles actually make their way into the lungs? What they do is they can actually activate cells such as macrophages and dendritic cells. So the macrophages come in again. So macrophages, so the macrophages will be in the lungs. So there's actually alveolar macrophages that are sitting there, and they're actually, because the lungs are in contact eventually with, outside air comes in there. So you have to defend the body from those things. So those particles can actually activate those cells, and they will try and mop them up. But then again, you are going to get that response. You know, you're going to get inflammation. So you may not feel great. You know, you're going to start coughing, or, you know, you might even get a little bit of excess fluid development. It can also activate, so a type of lymphocyte. So I'd mentioned lymphocytes before. So there's CD4 positive T cells, and what they do is they have cytokines that they secrete, and that's one of the things that's linked to an asthmatic response. So for those people that have asthma, those cells get activated, and also your lungs start to, like your alveoli start to contract. So, you know, people who have asthma, you know, you can't breathe. Your whole entire lungs are constricted because of that response that's happening. So someone who normally is pretty fine with their asthma until they get in contact with a particular allergen, or things like you know, smoke. If there is a really bad day of pollution, like, you know, if there's, you know, smog, you know, that, you know, where there's a day where all of the pollution's being trapped in the environment, asthmatics are going to have exacerbated responses those days. So, and then that ends up triggering inflammation. So, and then that can, again, say, for example, on that same day, they just so happen to come in contact with a cold virus. Yes. Maybe on a normal day, they wouldn't have really developed the full symptoms of that cold virus, and maybe they would have been able to defend themselves, but you impact all that pollution and their asthmatic response with whatever bacteria they're around, and they get sick. So pollution can certainly trigger obviously it can trigger inflammation, but it can also hamper your immune system and can make some people really sick. And you've even heard of things of people dying from things like these thunderstorms that suddenly create all these allergens in the air, and people have died. Like, it's unbelievable what can happen and how sensitive the body can be. But again, that's the body having a normal response. But in some people, that normal response can just go AWOL and unfortunately kill someone if it's not kept in check.
Yeah, isn't that so interesting?
Yeah.
It just and for me, I go fishing a lot with my husband, and when we're out on the water, I look back towards Brisbane and I'm like, oh my goodness, you can see it, you know, it hangs around
see the haze.
city, doesn't it? Yeah.
One of the worst cities, and I apologize to anybody who's from here, but in Los Angeles, like, if anybody has flown into Los Angeles, especially in the summer, it's just quite often this thick brownish yellow haze that you're landing through, and you just sort of go, oh, people. So I mean, you know, these things are going to you know, help trigger, you know, chronic diseases in people, you know, so the elderly will be more susceptible. There's way more asthma in places like that. Yeah,
interesting. And you were talking there about inflammation, the ways that, you know, it can come into the lungs, and we know that inflammation can come in contact, obviously, with the skin, but we're now seeing this real kind of trend towards the word inflammaging, which is your inflammation and your aging.
Yes.
And that really starting to speed up the aging process. I guess this all comes down to the telomeres and that kind of those little caps on the end of the chromosomes that are shortening our aging process. Do you mind just explaining for us how inflammation is actually affecting the way that we age?
Yeah. So I mean, I've definitely heard a lot about inflammaging, but it's not something that I was a super expert on. So I did a little bit of research on it, and it's actually a relatively new concept. So the term inflammaging refers to the chronic low-grade inflammation that's going on in our bodies, which a lot of us probably have now, that contributes to or characterizes what we see as aging. It's non-resolving inflammation. So it's inflammation that never really completes. It just keeps going on.
Right.
So that's sort of what it tends to be defined as. It reduces the body's ability to function properly. But as I said, it's a relatively new concept. And when I looked it up, so that concept, the inflammaging term, was first brought about in 2000. So that's actually relatively new.
Still quite new.
It is. but it's quickly, in some research papers, it's been quickly linked to diseases, like all the aging diseases, like Alzheimer's, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. But the mechanisms, they still don't completely understand the mechanisms. So I know there's definitely a lot of new aging research institutes that are popping up, and people are madly looking into this. So they know there's a link, but they don't know exactly the full mechanisms. What they do know is that macrophages are at the center of inflammation. My favorite cell. There you go.
Yeah.
So what they do know is macrophages are at the center of it. And it also involves the microbiota of the gut. So again, we keep coming back to this, how important it is. So what happens is it essentially involves all the bits and pieces of our own garbage in our system. So for example, we have cells that travel around in our body, and proteins that are going here and there, and cells will die. Cells do their job, and then they die, and then our body usually cleans them up and mops them up and gets rid of them. This happens with macrophages. Proteins that haven't been developed properly, they get degraded in something called the proteasome in a cell. So it's basically almost like a garbage compactor. So the proteins go into the proteasome, and what gets spit out are all the amino acids, and they can get recycled, basically. So what happens as we age is all of these molecules and remnants of dead cells and altered molecules, damaged DNA, and they normally get cleaned up. And as we age, that ability to do that decreases. So you have bits of dead cells that are floating around, altered molecules, and what they do is then they get seen by the body as foreign. So then the body starts, responding to these in an autoimmune fashion. And so you get this sort of low-grade inflammation happening because all this garbage is basically hanging around our bodies, and we can't deal with it as we age, especially if we're not taking care of ourselves. So there's actually a couple of really good research papers that are free open access that I'm happy to share in the group as well, sort of on this topic.
I would love that.
Because there's a few theories. So again, there's theories, and that's what scientists are working on right now, is testing these theories as to the link. But there's one of the really good review papers not too long ago in the Journal of Immunology, reviewed sort of the different current theories behind inflammaging. And of course, they're probably all involved in different stages. But they're, stress is one of them that contributes. Oxidation. So oxidation of proteins, oxidation, just reactive oxygen species in our body, pro-inflammatory cytokines. So whether that's, overproduction of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and that's what's happening. DNA damage. And as you mentioned, the telomeres, as we age, our DNA is basically getting shorter and shorter, and, their telomere length is very important and linked to aging, as well as stem cell aging. So the ability of your stem cells to come in and differentiate into the cells it needs to go to as tissue needs to repair, cells need to regenerate. So basically, the inflammation, if left unchecked and chronic, it does contribute to aging and age-related diseases, or disease linked to early death. So again, we've all kind of known this stuff for a little while, but it's getting down to the mechanisms of how all this happens, and it will come. It's, you hear about a particular cancer, and we say, scientists have discovered now the gene that is linked to this type of breast cancer, or, it takes years of research to nut down exactly what causes these diseases, or these like it's for something like inflammaging. It takes a lot of research to link all these things together. So, but we do eventually get there.
Lots of research. I guess the main principles really are: have a healthy mind, have a healthy body, and watch what you're putting into your mouth, and then live in a healthy environment.
Yeah, which is easily said for some people, but it's true. It's just making sure that we're putting the best things into and onto our body, to give ourselves the best outcome, so we don't end up with all these horrible diseases of aging.
Yeah, and I guess we're kind of ending on a little bit of a downer, but
I know,
I'm hoping
sorry.
to pick it up, pick up the energy again. We're talking about aging and pollution and stress, and oh my goodness. But what kind of ingredients do you kind of always look towards in times of inflammation?
Yeah. So things we can do both internal and external. So one of the internally, and some of it overlaps a bit. You will have heard a lot of research on something called resveratrol. So resveratrol is an extract from grapes, and this is where everybody tries to say, oh, if you drink red wine, that's good for you, which is fair enough. But the amount of wine you'd have to drink to get the resveratrol you need is a bit ridiculous. But internally, you have to think of the inside and the outside. So internally, supplements like resveratrol, there's also curcumin, like turmeric, which is something that we're very passionate about, is an amazing antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. Something as simple as calorie restriction. So, you hear about all these different, but moderate calorie restriction. You hear about some of these diets where, I forget, there's like the 5-2, where it's you hear all these diets where you have sort of moderated calorie restriction, which can be quite good for you. Interestingly, metformin. So metformin is what people take to regulate their blood sugar in type 2 diabetes. So, if you're someone that's sitting there with all this low-grade inflammation, you're borderline type 2 diabetes, your GP might actually put you on metformin to sort of get things in check. And that's actually not necessarily a bad thing, because it can actually be quite good for your body to start regulating some of this inflammation. Going back to eating well, the omega-3 fatty acids, and getting things checked like your B vitamins and your D vitamins, and see if some of those need to be supplemented specifically. But in terms of topical, there's so many fantastic ingredients out there, and we tend to focus on the natural ones, and that's where things like turmeric come in. Again, such an amazing anti-inflammatory, and you hear about it so much. It really is really great as a topical for inflammation. We know things like calendula and chamomile are very calming as well. Arnica and ginger are both good for inflammation, but ginger as well for your immunity. So ginger is very, very good for immunity. One that not everybody may have heard about is astaxanthin, which is an antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, very, very powerful as well. So they're quite good. Aloe vera, of course, we know that aloe vera is very calming and gentle to the skin, or it can be for most people, and can calm inflammation. An interesting one is willow bark. I don't know if people have heard about willow bark. It's good for acne, but it's also quite good for inflammation as well. Then you've got some other good antioxidants like green tea and pomegranate. Those are quite good, both topically and internally. Now, interestingly, licorice extract. So a lot of people know about licorice extract for its brightening effects, but it actually is quite good for antioxidant inflammation as well. And then one really good Australian that I'll sort of finish off with here is kakadu plum. So kakadu plum is amazing, very, very high in vitamin C, but also a stable form of vitamin C. So it's just really, really good topically. So again, it's having a good mix of anti-inflammatories and antioxidants topically to help calm. And then this then ties back into our treatments, so when you're looking at something that you're going to be doing on the face that's going to trigger some mild inflammation, you need to start looking at the ingredients, obviously, that you're putting on afterwards, and whether that's immediately for something that's more mild inflammation that you're inducing, or if you're doing something a bit more invasive, then you want to wait a couple of days before you start putting some of these ingredients on the face as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Donna. It has been an absolute pleasure having you return to the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure too.
What an incredible topic to cover, and what an incredible woman. One-on-one educational information like this would normally set you back a small fortune, and for that I am so thrilled that we can bring this education to you for free. Next time you see inflammation on the skin or body, I hope that some of this information permeates into your thinking and that you proceed treatment planning with the wound healing response in mind. If you think your colleagues, your boss, or anyone else should listen to this episode, please feel free to share it with them by grabbing their phone, opening up this podcast and showing them how to subscribe. And if you love today's episode too, show us some love by hitting that 5-star rating or by writing us a review. It's free and it helps us to continue to educate more industry ears. Thank you again for tuning into this episode. We so appreciate your support. Until next time, stay connected.